everybody!
Turn this up in my headphones, Charles.
Turning it up! Hello, everybody, one and all. Welcome to yet another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy Podcast. My name is Charles, and with me today, as always, is my lifelong friend and co-host, Dylan.
I'm ready to talk some fantasy with my friend, Charles.
I am ready to talk some fantasy with my friend as well, Dylan, but not just any fantasy today, because today we get to revisit one of those series that we just cannot stop talking about, don't want to stop talking about, and that is the Kingkiller Chronicles by Patrick Rothfuss.
Yeah, if you take a look at our episode catalog, you probably get the sense that we like to talk about the Kingkiller Chronicle by Patrick Rothfuss. Because we're always, and I think this is a series that just has so much fodder for amazing conversations. Mm-hmm. And we'd love to have these conversations in a way in which they would be accessible to everyone no matter where they're at. But some of these deeper conversations lend themselves to more spoilers if we're going to really do them right, or at least opening the doorway to us being able to have spoilers. So this is one of those conversations, and we're thinking of this, what is the Kingkiller Chronicle about, as more of thematically what kind of story is Patrick Rothfuss trying to tell with the Kingkiller Chronicle, which is totally not clear yet, in part because there are only 2 out of 3 books available. So as two people who've read those 2 books, trying to speculate what do we think Patrick Rothfuss might be trying to convey to us about this series. So if you are tuning in thinking, well, but I actually want to know what the book is about, I do want to get the surface stuff out of the way before I give you my spoiler warning, which is it's basically an epic figure who is now in living a life as a humble innkeeper under a disguised name, who has been sought out by a chronicler of stories to recount his tale, what that innkeeper claims to be the truth of his tale from his words. And it's basically how this person, or him telling the story of how he became the figure of Quoth, who's such a legendary person, more myth than man at this point, is I think what I said back in our The Name of the Wind Buddy Reed episode. So he's sitting down with a chronicler and with his apprentice named Bast, and telling his story in his inn over the course of 3 days. So that's what the Kingkiller Chronicle is at the surface about. And now I want to let anyone know who hasn't read The Name of the Wind and The Wise Man's Fear, the first 2 books of the Kingkiller Chronicle, that this is a good time to turn this episode down in your headphones if you don't want to have anything spoiled. I'm not sure what plot points we'll get into, but we're not going to hold back if things come up.
That's absolutely well said, Dylan. So with this blanket, what's Kingkiller about, premise set up, and with the spoiler warning in, I think we're ready to get right into the discussion here, because it's not like the reason we decided to record this, because the more we thought about the question, like, oh, what is this about, it took on like almost this meta idea of what Kingkiller Chronicle is about. And then also, of course, there's a lot of points that we had mentioned in preparation for this episode of what Kingkiller is not about.
Yes, and I feel like Patrick Rothfuss would appreciate this. Like, when asked a question about what the Kingkiller Chronicle is about, I feel like he might be willing to say, here's some of what it's not about. So we'll try to do him Justice in all his whimsy and amazing like discussion when he's asked questions. So I think that the Kingkiller Chronicle, Charles, I think you'd probably agree with me that it's the most, in our experience of discussing many books on the Friends Talking Fantasy podcast at this point, it is the one that is the most controversial for just like generating either in the love direction or the hate direction people's thoughts and opinions and questions and all this kind of stuff. And I think a lot of that comes from a discrepancy between what they want the story to be about or what they think the story is going to be about and the kind of story that Patrick Rothfuss is actually trying to tell. Would you agree with that before we get into these points?
Yes, I would agree. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I think there's been a lot of speculation about what's actually going to happen because these books are not finished yet. That's a very unique thing about this series compared to other like highly discussed series. There's still so much attention and liveliness brought into these books. And because it's so open to interpretation, people have very different takes on what their reading experience is like. And what makes these books so brilliant to me is that, like there are multiple ways to experience these books because what these books are about are not, so obviously stated in the narrative of the story.
That's well said, Charles. Yeah, I think that there's a lot of things. The story is is flipping a lot of the things that we're used to in the genre on their heads, but while almost presenting those things with the kind of story structure where sometimes readers feel they're being made promises of what the story is about, and then those things aren't being fulfilled for them. And I think the number one thing that comes up for me around that is some folks feel like they want the story to be about how Quoth, who was orphaned after the Chandrian killed his parents and his whole Ademaru troop, they want the story to be about how this legendary figure rose up and took vengeance upon the Chandrian, these evil figures in the world. And we're so used to these stories about characters rising up against evil lords or figures or magical evil entities or what have you. And the Kingkiller Chronicle, pretty early on in The Name of the Wind, sets up that kind of premise. And I know the first time I was reading it, that's what I started to think when that event happens where the Chandrian kill his parents. I was like, oh, that's what this is about. It's about vengeance on the Chandrian and how he got that. And it was only later that I started to think this fits more in the category of here's what I think it's actually not about.
Right. Rothfuss definitely presents the Chandrian as, this, like, the leader of the Chandrian being like this big bad guy. And every once in a while, the Chandrian make an appearance in the story, but, it's not frequent enough, and it doesn't. It drives a lot of Quelth's motivations, but not all of them. And so much of the story is just taking place outside of that plot line that I would agree, and that this is an element, but I think we're purposefully dancing around it. And that's why I would agree with you and say that this book is not necessarily about getting vengeance on the Chandrian. We just haven't spent too much time, like after two very long books, concerned about the Chandrian or trying to hunt them down. Life is kind of living in between those moments, and so much of the book is in between those moments that it's hard to say that this is a vengeance story.
I feel the same way. And you mentioned the leader of the Chandrian, Haliax, and it's kind of like the best antagonists have presence in the story throughout in one way or another. I can't tell you what the best antagonists are like, but in my experience of reading, I enjoy the antagonists that have a presence throughout the story. And I would say Heliax has very little presence
Very
throughout the
little.
story, besides kind of in quotes head that, like you said, a lot of the things he does is this like, I'd like to get vengeance on Heliax, I'd like to get vengeance on Cinder is another one. Cinder, depending on how some things work out with like identities and whatnot that I won't get into the details of. Cinder might have more of a presence, like he might be Master Ash and all this kind of stuff, who's Denna's patron. But all that being said, those two characters are the main Chandrian involved in the story, and even them, it's like they're not hugely present. Cinder a little bit more, and that being said, the story is like pretty explicitly presented as like being tragic in a lot of ways. We'll get into that a little bit more later. So yeah, it's hard to think that the story is going to be one of Quoth rising up and getting vengeance on the Chandrian in victory, and that's fine for me because I talk all the time on here about I'm super character focused to the point where like I don't know, like vengeance on an evil lord. I feel like I've seen that a lot of times in stories, and for me it's all in the telling of that kind of story. It could be really good, it could be really bad, but for me I don't really like, it doesn't need to be that. But I see how people experience a character getting their parents killed by an evil lord and then thinking, oh, that's what this story is about, and getting attached to that idea, and then going on to be like, oh, like why is Quoth just like having a day in day out life in school, and why is Quoth like running around chasing Denna and having this like weird sort of, and I think amazingly written dynamic with her, and just having these moments with Ari that like, where do those fit in, that are just feel like them having time spent together. And it's like, how's all this fit into this vengeance on the Chandrian story that I expect to be told? And I see where the frustration happens for a lot of people there, and I explicitly see people bringing up like, why is Quoth out there doing this? Like, when is it going to get back to the real plot, which is him going after the Chandrian? And those are like one of the most common ways I see people like who feel like the story meanders and feels like they're not being given what they want from the Kingkiller Chronicle.
Yeah, that's so well said. It's these moments are part of the story, but it's not what the story's about. And I think that's the important distinction. And I mean, that being said, there's still a whole other book. We know that there is a fallout at some point, and I believe that touching on our expectations in terms of vengeance stories and big bad villains and all the supernatural villains and all these other things is presented in such a traditional way that when we know that this ends at the Waystone Inn, we're like, what happens in between? Like, if he really defeated the Chandrian, wouldn't he be happy? Like, why is he so defeated in these moments? So like, all like it serves to drive those questions of what happened to Quoth that he became Coat.
For sure. And maybe he does, like, I want to preface all of this too with some degree of, we could be entirely wrong.
Yeah.
It's happened to us both before. And it will happen to us again at some point. These are our opinions of what we think it's going to be about. Maybe in book 3, the big reveal is this has all been a story about vengeance on Chandrian. But I don't expect it will be. And I do think that even if he gets vengeance on the Chandrian in book 3, I expect the twist on it will be that it came at some cost that was like not worth it. So his decision to actually pursue that rather than just like indulge himself in the more day-to-day of like savoring, we'll get into more of that too. I imagine that there would be some twist to that story that Rothfuss would present, but we'll save that for our book 3 buddy read discussion when that does come. Yes, we're very much looking forward to that discussion when it does come. So, and to clear that up before anyone thinks that means that the book is on the horizon, there is no release date. that we are aware of. Oh yeah, sorry for any folks hoping for that. But I've got another what this book isn't about.
Okay.
And Charles, you may not be surprised that this has to do with Denna. So I think another way in which I see people not happy with the story they're getting from the Kingkiller Chronicle is when they want the story to be a romance where the hero, quote unquote, gets the girl. And I think the Denna and Quoth relationship, we've talked that relationship arguably to death at this point, although I'll probably keep going well past the point of its death. But we both think it's incredibly well written. We talked about our favorite romances and fantasy discussion as one of our top 3. And all that being said, we're reading The Wheel of Time also right now and things like that. And I won't get into details of that, but some of these things are played more traditionally with romantic relationships in that book. And I think people are used to reading fantasy stories where the hero does these great feats and then the love interest falls all over them for doing that. And Quoth, we know, is going to do all of these great feats. He's already done some of them to this point. They usually play out a little bit different than we might expect, but he's done some pretty impressive things. And all that time, Denna is there just not falling over herself for him, at least not in the traditional way we're used to, where she's just like, oh, Quoth, please be with me. I want to have a traditional relationship with you and be saved by you and all these kind of things. And yeah.
Yes. And this all comes back to where this book starts, right? They're at the Waystone Inn, a man waiting to die. We know there is no victory in these moments that we're getting because we know where it ends up. So when we're pitched these storylines after knowing that, it's like, well, if he got the girl, if he ends up in a relationship with Denna, why is he waiting to die by himself at the Waystone Inn? Where is Denna?
Yes.
It's clearly the romance is not what it is about specifically, but we know it plays an incredibly important part. And there's still so many mysteries that anything could still happen at this point. There's lots of great theories about, we hinted at, who Denna's patron is, that she has reverse feelings about the Chandrian and all these other things.
Right, and the Amir, kind of like a mirror image.
Right.
Of that. And it could be about that to some extent.
Yeah, and that is very interesting, and I wouldn't mind that being the direction that book 3 goes in. But even if it does or does not, the point is, it's not about any of these defining moments. It's if I could only get here, I would win and the story would be over. It's that's not what's happening. We're trying to learn more about this character and figure out where he's going. So trying to figure out what is Kingkiller Chronicle about. It's well, there is the Chandrian and there is this romance, but it all ends here at the Waystone Inn. And how do we get there? And who is this character about? And what is this really about? Trying to piece that out. Is it how we got here at the Waystone Inn? Is that what we're trying to learn at this moment? Or is it something else?
Well, Charles, I'm glad you bring up the Waystone Inn because this reminds me of a quote I pulled that I was hoping to get the chance to talk about in this episode, which is this moment where Quoth reflects on the kind of story that he's telling. This is, I believe, in the immediate aftermath of him revealing the Cathay. I could be wrong about that being where it shows up, but I do believe it is then. And the quote is in response to Bast, who's freaking out, if I'm remembering correctly. Oh, Bast, he said softly to his student. His smile was gentle and sad. I know what sort of story I'm telling. This is no comedy. This is the end of the story, Bast. We all know that. And it says, Quoth's voice was matter of fact, as casual as if he were describing yesterday's weather. I have led an interesting life, and this reminiscence has a certain sweetness to it. But, it goes on, But this is not a dashing romance. This is no fable where folk come back from the dead. It's not a rousing epic meant to stir the blood. No, we all know what kind of story this is. And note that Quoth doesn't finish that is by describing, well, it's this kind of story. It's a very, I think, Rothfussian, if that, can I say that? Rothfussian?
Sure.
It sounds good. Yeah. It's a very Rothfussian thing, which is this kind of, I'll tell you what it isn't, and let you, he loves questions, right? Rothfuss has been very clear about, like, a lot of times questions are more interesting to him than answers. And this quote, I think it implies that, well, we all know it's a tragedy. And I think that's the most like straightforward expectation of at least the tone of the story. It doesn't tell us what the themes and what it's about necessarily is, but I do think it seems to imply that it's a tragedy. It seems to imply it is not about like Quoth's telling the story, and he's a very good storyteller. He's a Dimaru. He's not going to say it's it's not a rousing epic if it's a rousing epic. So I think like these sort of like Chandrian revenge moments are trying to fit it into this rousing epic meant to stir the blood thing that Quoth explicitly says it's not that story. And I think it really, a big part of it, and we'll get into the themes of what that is about more, is what you were talking about, Charles, of this like, we're at the Waystone. It's been probably, unless we're wrong, a tragedy. Things have gone really awry, and that's already occurred. So how did we get here? And yeah, I'll have more, but I'll throw it to you.
Right. No, that's well said, and that's a great quote because it's like Quoth is a storyteller, so he's not going to play all his cards in that moment. He does want to keep you invested. He can't help but still give a performance. So it's like, look, this is my story. I know what kind of story it is, and it's, not the ones that we're all hoping for. And that is such an interesting moment, and it puts a lot of these pieces into question of like, well, then what is this about and what is happening? Like, it's called the Kingkiller Chronicles, but like there's like no kings have been killed, and we're like 2/3 into this.
We got an email about that yesterday. Shout out to Rachel.
Oh yes, yeah. Thank you for sending an email at the ftfpodcast@gmail.com. And exactly right. It's like, has any kings been killed? We assume so, but we don't know definitively yet. There's like, for me, it's like, is this all going to get wrapped up in the snowball of resolution in this third book? Like, there's so many unanswered questions, but is that the point of this story at the same time? And it's not so obvious. Rothfuss has left everything open. Has said nothing definitive. The only thing we really know is that somehow we end up here at the Waystonian waiting to die. Like, that's the one thing we can be sure of. So how we get there will be quite an interesting journey.
Yes, it will be a very interesting journey. So I think that we've transitioned at this point in the episode away from the what is Kingkiller not about, and I do think we're ready to get into a little bit more of what we think it actually might be about thematically. And the first thing that comes up for me as we're talking about these ideas of like, we know it ends at the Waystone, we know all these like rough things have happened already, is this idea of like a beautiful game, which we've talked about before. We've talked about this parallel between Tak, which is the game that Quoth plays over Quoth plays this game with Braden, and he's kind of taught this lesson of like, you can try to like ruthlessly try to beat me at this game, but it's actually like way less fun, and Quoth ends up losing anyway when he tries to do that. In fact, losing more brutally than he does when he just kind of like has fun playing this board game. And I think that's a big thing here that parallels all sorts of different elements of the story. Even just like the title, The Name of the Wind, is like this idea of like you can't actually figure out the name of the wind once and
Define
for all.
it, yeah.
It's always changing, and it's more about being with it where it is in that moment. And once you let go of this trying to win and once and for all discern the name of the wind, you can just be present and it's just there. And it might be different tomorrow. Well, it's probably different the next moment, but you're not trying to force it into this box of what it originally was. And I think that reflects the name of the wind. I think it reflects like his relationship with Denna, which is explicitly, there's a quote, "So I did not try to win her and contented myself with playing a beautiful game, but there was always a part of me that hoped for more, and so there's a part of me that was always a fool." So I think that's such a big part of this, is like any part of quote that's trying to win and figure something out once and for all and have things, that tends to not be great for his life. But when he's just chilling and playing a beautiful game, that's when things start to come into view. So I really wonder if a lot of the Kingkiller Chronicle is about this, like, Quoth. It's a tragedy because Quoth never learned to play the beautiful game. I don't know what you think of that, Charles.
I think that's so true. This idea of the name of the wind. It's like, well, how do you name something that's ever changing and always moving? And for Quoth, the times where he is successfully naming things are when he is so in the moment and he's not actually trying to think about defining it or puzzling it out or anything like that. It's he's emotionally invested in the moment, and that's what causes him to achieve great things, including calling on the wind every once in a while. And that translates into every piece of the story that, like we've mentioned multiple times, this idea of the beautiful game, of being emotionally invested in the moment and exploring it. And even in the narration and the writing style that Rothfuss uses, of where we've often described it as poetic and things of that nature, it's like he's enjoying writing about what's happening, and he's fully invested in what's going on in these moments, that he's not necessarily like plotting groundwork to the final face-off with the Chandrian. It's these scenes in between, and Rothfuss is deliberately putting off on addressing the Chandrian to get us to be like, yeah, that's something we want to see, but there's all these beautiful moments in life happening in between, where he's going on dates and going to class and talking with his friends and playing music. That is what's really important. So this idea of balancing priorities, focusing on like this poetry, and then also calling on this idea of everything good that happens is when I'm embracing the moment and not trying to, as we say all the time, capture the moon.
Yes, exactly. There's that incredible story within a story. There's this whole, God, I'll see if I can get it right on the spot, of what I like to say about the Kingkiller Chronicle, which is calling it a story about stories that is a story within a story. And sometimes they'll go a level deeper of telling a story in that. And that's what the story about Jax and the moon, which we love chatting about on here. Honestly, that could be its own episode, maybe. It's like,
if we haven't repeated it over and over, yeah, it would be a very great.
Honestly, well, like Charles, this is maybe a little podcast logistic-y, but maybe people would be interested in this. Like, if we reread the Jax and the Moon part of the Kingkiller Chronicle and just had a discussion focused on that, I actually think that could be really interesting. That's literally like the way we take a buddy read episode for a typical like book, is like treating the Jax and the Moon story that way, with of course the awareness that's in the Kingkiller Chronicle. I think that could be interesting. But anyway, I think it's amazing that you bring up the prose when you were talking before there, Charles, which is like, I think that's all part of this. Is like the beauty of the Kingkiller Chronicle is it works on so many levels, even to this more like meta level of like the way that Rothfuss treats writing his book feels much more like this beautiful game idea too, because not only is it not like plot-wise having these moments of these rousing epic to stir the blood constantly. It's just like the sentence by sentence of this prose is written so beautifully. I mean, in all the controversy that we've seen on social media and elsewhere about the Kingkiller Chronicle, Charles, the thing I've almost never seen I don't know if I've ever seen someone claim that the prose is not good, and oftentimes, like, the one thing that the vast majority of people that I've interacted with think about the Kingkiller Chronicle is that it has fantastic prose, even if they're not happy about just about anything else about it. So it's literally like the process of reading this story is in itself a beautiful game, and it's just a pleasure to sit down with and read. And when we as readers start trying to, like, even the idea, we love theorizing about the Kingkiller Chronicle and stuff like that, but even that idea of trying to, like, pin down what's going to happen and know it, and like trying to figure everything out in the moment of reading it can get you lost in all of this discerning and thinking and ruminating in the same way Quoth does. But like, in some ways, I find I enjoy the Kingkiller Chronicle most when I just sit back and enjoy each sentence and treat this sort of journey before destination approach to reading it.
That's kind of our mantra about Kingkiller Chronicles, very eloquently stated. It's true. It's all about this idea of journey over destination, and Rothfuss, from the story to the writing, just embodies it completely. And while it's fun to speculate, and it's like, I can't believe there's only one more book left, even though it's probably going to be a 1,000-page brick, it's like, how are we going to, like, what does the ending look like for this story? And that's fueled a lot of discussion over the years while we wait patiently for the next book to come out. There's no shortage of ideas to speculate on and discuss, but one thing we can be certain on is that we should enjoy the moments that we do have, just for the fact that they're well written, and they're emotional at times, and they're honest at times, and they're depressing at times, they're frustrating at times, and that's just what life is like.
For sure. Yeah. And that's super well said, Charles. I think that, and that's part of what's so great about this, is that's what life is like. And the story that's being told is supposed to be this person who is just, it's a fantasy version of an autobiography, essentially. Like, obviously, there's a frame story, which makes it not a straightforward, like, if it were an autobiography by Quoth or Quoth. But if you're telling your true story or trying to get it right, and you're almost, like, there's moments where Quoth basically, like, tries to teach Chronicler the lesson of, like, hey, what if I started building up your name and reputation as something that's fake and a myth and all these things that pump you up to be something better or different or scary or whatever than you actually are. Like, that doesn't feel good. And you remember that moment, Charles,
yes,
when he does that to Chronicler? He, like, teaches, it's a interesting moment. Like, he starts spreading rumors kind of about, like, the Chronicler and what he's like, and paints him as this epic figure. And Quoth is in this place where he's like, I've already heard every version of this story about me. I'm going to do my best to frame it in the way that I see the narrative. And that doesn't mean the narrative is inherently true. I think it's unreliable still in the ways that if any of us was telling the story about our own life, it would play out in a way that is somewhat off base from reality. If I told my story, it'd be somewhat off base from the actual reality. And I think that's a big reason why it fits into this, like, story about storytelling aspect too, where it's like we're learning these things about how stories are told and how people come to understand their own narratives about themselves and try to be understood by others. And again, it's kind of this, like, this idea of there's not this objective right. It's all this more like subjective story and understanding of things. The beautiful game of telling and trying to understand one's own story. So yeah, which is super meaningful, I think, for me to read it through that lens.
Yeah, it's what makes these books so fun. The fact that Rothfuss can create a beautiful game in the story where it's just the experience of just being in it in the moment is so rewarding. And when you're writing a big sprawling fantasy series, that is not necessarily something easily achieved when you have to get so much world building done and set up plots and characters and plot lines and arcs and all these other things, where Rothfuss is like, we can bring those things up as they come along, but like we're also just, we're going to go to school now, and we're going to go on a date now, and we're going to, travel here and there, and find ourselves teleported to the Fae and all these other things that we're going to find ourselves doing, for better or for worse. But the fact that he was able to create that experience and not only make a story about it thematically, but to also embody that theme in his writing, it is why Patrick Rothfuss stands way, way high up in regard for us on the show here. It's just like an incredible accomplishment.
Yeah, and it's an incredible accomplishment, like you said, Charles. And this is the thing, is like another level of reflecting on how Rothfuss thinks about these things, is more like, let's raise questions, let's think about things, but let's not try to make the thinking process about discerning the objective right answer, is also honestly feels reflected in the fact he hasn't given us the third and final book yet. And even the fact that when he talks about the third book, he's like, oh, the whole thing, like, I don't know where he's standing on this now, but at times he said, like, the whole thing's basically a prequel anyway. And it's like, which people had reactions to, as that I won't get into, but it's like this idea that Rothfuss doesn't want to try to tell you the name of the wind. He doesn't want you to know the name of the wind once and for all and give you all these answers. He, I think, likes the idea of these questions and these conversations and these, like, let's enjoy what we have right now. And it's kind of like a lot of where the focus goes. And it goes this way for us too, for sure, Charles. We're as guilty as other people, I think, with trying to like figure out the answers of like, is this, or at least I am. I won't speak for you, but I'm out there like having these email conversations where I'm like trying to tell people who I think Cinder actually is, and I think I've figured out these connections between Cinder and Master Ash because both of them have, Quoth has a talent for naming, and he accidentally called Master Ash Ash, which is a synonym for Cinder, and all this kind of stuff, right? And I'm trying to figure out these answers because I think that's a normal tendency to do, but I think that's part of what, I don't know Patrick Rothfuss or anything like that, but I get this sense that that's probably part of the hesitation for him with moving forward on providing a third book that's supposed to give all these answers. When Rothfuss, there's that quote that we've pulled this quote before, but I do think it's apropos here, where Rothfuss says, not Rothfuss himself, or like in the book, Rothfuss writes, right. It's the questions we can't answer that teach us the most. They teach us how to think. If you give a man an answer, all he gains is a little fact, but give him a question and he'll look for his own answers. And I think there's kind of this, like, Rothfuss likes the idea of people like teaching themselves and deliberating and stuff, as long as there wasn't a right answer to have pinned down once and for all. And once he puts out that third book, there is kind of this answer once and for all. And that's kind of, I don't know, it feels almost inimical to how I imagine Rothfuss thinks about his writing.
I agree 100%. I feel like the fandom's so alive for all those reasons that you said. Yes. It's much more fun to be excited about where it's going and to speculate and to find meaning in some of these moments.
Yeah.
And yeah, it makes it hard to write that final moment. So we'll see how Rothfuss delivers on his themes in his final book. And however long it needs to perfect that craft, I'm willing to wait, because it seems like a tricky thing to bring home, is to deliver a sense of finality to this story that's so much
Yeah,
about the moment.
I agree. And I think that's kind of how, we're here trying to have this what is Kingkiller about conversation. And I think that I, uh, if we sought to find the explicit answer and to tell you, like, well, we figured it out, here's what the Kingkiller Chronicle is about, that is kind of contrary to how we think of the series.
Right.
So to try to ask this and answer this question directly, or I mean, we tried it directly, but to answer it explicitly or with a clear, like, here it is almost contrary, to the Kingkiller Chronicle and the message that we take from it anyway. And because, like, this, I think the Kingkiller Chronicle is about the journey. It is about each beautifully written sentence. It's about these relationships and enjoying moments for what they are. It's about how, I mean, in part, we talked about this, like how Quoth's life might have been better if he just stopped looking for all of those explicit answers and ways to win and figure it out once and for all, and just chilled out and, like, tried to, like, acknowledged even things like, hey, my parents are dead. That's terrible. That's awful. It's tragic. And vengeance isn't going to get me anything if I just chilled with, like, he knows a lot of really nice people, right? Like,
yes.
Sim is super nice, like, super nice dude. I would love to be friends with Sim if he were real. Ari, super nice.
Yes.
Like, maybe I think Denna has a good heart underneath it all. There's evidence, like, she helps out that girl who's down on her luck in the Wise Man's Fear, these kind of things. The kind of person that if Quoth maybe stopped, like, trying to win, or got rid of that part of him that was trying to win her and, like, capture her, maybe, who knows, maybe that relationship could work out. I mean, I think it's kind of toxic how they relate to each other right now, but I think they both have the capability, if they chilled out and tried to enjoy the moments, of even being together. And there's, like, all these, and, shout out to Will as well. I don't want to leave Will out of this equation.
You can't leave Will out of the
Quoth,
equation.
You can't leave Will out. Quoth knows all of these, like, pretty great people, and they relate to him and they care about him, and he doesn't always let them in because of his struggles with vulnerability. And it's like almost, it's like sad in these ways of, like, trying to relentlessly pursue and find these answers, because that's a lot of what he's doing with chasing the answers to who the Chandrian are and the Aemir and all this kind of stuff, is getting in the way for Quoth of just enjoying the beautiful game. And I hope that, Charles, our relentless pursuit of trying to figure out what the Kingkiller is about does not prevent us from trying to just sit back and enjoy the beautiful game too, and our relationships and our journey, including this awesome lifelong journey of friendship that I'm on with you.
That is well said and hard to top, but yes, it's true. We can speculate all day about what Kingkiller is about, but I think we left with just as many things to think about as opposed to answers. And the important takeaway is that I enjoyed recording it very much with my lifelong friend Dylan here on the Friends Talking Fantasy podcast.
Well, that's what the Friends Talking Fantasy podcast is about.
Absolutely.
Just chatting with my buddy and enjoying it. And I think we did that today. So, yeah, if you're ready to do Quoth the honor of getting some sweet, sweet music pumping, maybe get that outro music going then. Are you ready, Charles?
Oh, yeah, I'm ready. Let's do it.
Cool.
Thank you, everybody, for listening to yet another very exciting episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy podcast. This has been your co-host, Charles and Dylan. If you like what you heard today, reach out to us on social media over on Twitter at the FTF Podcast with a number 1 at the end. And we're also on Instagram and Facebook at the FTF Podcast. If you want to message us directly, you can always send us an email at theftfpodcast@gmail.com. Now, Dylan, if they wanted to further support the show and they just so happen to be listening on Apple Podcasts, what can they do?
Toss 5 stars to our podcast.
Yes.
Just find that Friends Talking Fantasy page on the Apple Podcast app. Scroll down past any of those episodes that you're seeing until you start seeing stars. Once you're seeing stars, the best optimal number of stars to click to support the show would be 5 of them. If you have a little bit of extra time and want to write a review, that can help us even more. But just listening, sitting back and enjoying what we hope is a beautiful game of me and Charles chatting about fantasy and the Kingkiller Chronicle, that's more than enough. Thank you so much for being a part of this.
Thank you, everyone, for listening to us continually discuss about Kingkiller Chronicles. We gratefully appreciate the support. Thank you all for listening, and as always, go forth and conquer, friends.